So now let's look at the structure of ETFs that use a swap-based approach. And also let's look at how counterparty exposure is addressed. Now, one of the first things you need to understand about an ETF is what exactly is an index swap. Well, in itself, it's a very, very simple structure. An index swap is simply an agreement to swap the performance of an index for a basket of securities. And what an ETF that uses a swap-based structure does is it enters into what's known as an arm's-length index swap agreement with a swap counterparty, typically an investment bank such as Deutsche Bank. And the swap effectively guarantees back to the ETF the perfect performance of the index that's been tracked. As I mentioned earlier, when UCITS 3 came into being, UCITS allowed for the first time all fund structures to use derivative contracts. And as such, we saw and have seen the growth and the emergence of absolute return funds and indeed swap-based ETFs. But by giving the additional flexibility to use index swaps, UCITS wanted to ensure that their use was controlled and restricted. And because of that, they introduced a maximum limit that the swap itself could account for to the value of the actual fund being used. And that limit is 10%. The value of the swap can never exceed 10% of the NAV of the underlying ETF. Now, the best way to explain this is to consider the example that we had earlier, the FTSE 100 ETF. In this case, the physical ETF that we looked at earlier goes and buys all the underlying securities in the actual index. Now, quite often, the swap-based ETF structure is known as the indirect replication ETF structure. And I'll explain why. In this particular case, the FTSE 100 ETF enters into a swap agreement with a swap counterparty. And the swap counterparty guarantees back to the ETF the perfect performance of the index. But how does it do this? Obviously, it has a problem in terms of being able to deliver this. And the only way it can do this is by actually physically going and holding all of the underlying securities. And this is in what we call the hedge position. It's important to understand that this is actually outside the ETF structure. The ETF itself is getting the perfect performance of the index. But in order to deliver the performance of the index, the ETF swap provider has to himself hedge himself in the market by physically owning. This is why it's sometimes known as an indirect ETF structure. As we mentioned earlier, under UCITS, you have a restriction that the value of the swap itself can never account for greater than 10% of the net asset value of the ETF. So where's the other 90%? This sits in what's known as a collateral basket of securities. And if the value of the swap can never exceed 10%, the value by default of the collateral basket of securities can never in itself be less than 90%. However, what some swap-based providers have done is to post additional collateral into this collateral basket to a value in excess of this 90% minimum requirement. And in fact, at Deutsche Bank, we have posted, for most of our equity, commodity, and currency ETFs, collateral greater than the value of the ETF itself. And in actual fact, we post a minimum of 105% collateral into this collateral basket. And therefore, the value of the swap has a zero value compared to the value of the ETF itself. So this over-collateralization or fully collateralized structure, as you can see, has now addressed an issue of counterparty exposure. It's really important to understand that this collateral basket is completely ring-fenced by the custodian, in our case State Street. The securities in this collateral basket have to satisfy UCITS requirements in terms of their quality, and they cannot be touched and they cannot be lent out. But in this structure, under the swap-based ETF approach, the same level of enhancements in terms of stock lending revenue can be generated through the hedge position and passed back through to the ETF. So effectively, you have a structure here now where you're getting perfect index tracking of the index you're trying to follow. You get an over-collateralized structure to a certain extent, mitigating or eliminating the level of exposure to this swap. Perhaps an easier way to think of this in a visual term is to think of the three generations of ETFs as we've described them. The first generation, as we like to think of them, these are the physical or direct replication ETFs. The net asset value, the NAV of the ETF, is accounted for by the securities held by that ETF structure. This is fairly easy to understand. The second generation of ETFs came into being with the introduction of UCITS 3 and the ability for funds such as ETFs to use swaps. In this particular case, the performance of the ETF is delivered through the swap, the net asset value, if you like, but the collateral position has to never be less than 90%, and the swap potentially can have no greater than a maximum of 10% exposure. But as I've just described, what we have now moved on to at Deutsche Bank is the third generation ETF structure, the fully collateralized, or in fact over-collateralized structure of ETF, where we post collateral greater to the value of the actual ETF itself. So in the unlikely event of a default by the swap provider, if the custodian himself could not appoint another swap provider and the ETF had to be wound up, there's a greater value in the actual ETF itself than actually needs to be there. So in the event that the ETF had to be liquidated, then all investors would be paid out. Now, the features that are used of the collateral within a swap-based ETF are strictly controlled by UCITS in terms of the actual quality and the transferability. It's important to understand that, as I said earlier, they cannot be accessed by the swap counterparty in the event of a default situation. Typically for equity ETFs, the collateral, typically blue chip equities, and for investment grade bonds for our fixed interest range of ETFs. This ETF that uses this structure, the collateral basket is typically valued on every business day. And the collateral basket is dynamically managed as well to ensure that those minimum preset limits that we set are never breached. It's important also to understand that there's no securities lending that takes place within the collateral basket by Deutsche Bank at least. So there's no counterparty exposure at the collateral basket level. Now, all ETF providers are very transparent in terms of publishing this information. We ourselves, including some other providers, post this information on our website, and you can look at any of our ETFs that utilize this structure, click on the appropriate tab on the performance and the actual fund information, and you can actually see the underlying components in terms of the top 20 holdings, or indeed the entire list of collateral that's held. But don't expect to see the full replication of the index that you're replicating being held in a collateral basket. Collateral is simply collateral. In this particular example, around about 30% of the collateral supporting this particular ETF, the FTSE 100, is based up of UK stocks. The balance are other international equities. Some concluding thoughts then. When you're looking at comparing physical and the direct approach with the indirect or the swap-based approach, you need to understand that who's actually doing the tracking, who's delivering the tracking performance for you. In the case of a physical or direct replication ETF, there is a fund manager actually doing this job. In the case of a swap-based or indirect ETF structure, that's actually outsourced to an index swap provider. You get perfect index tracking, therefore, before fees. Both structures are capable of generating enhancements and can do so. And within the terms of UCITS 3, there are these restrictions in terms of the maximum amount of counterparty exposure that can be existing in an index swap structure. And as I've explained, this can be offset through collateralization and regular resetting. And in many cases, the over-collateralization of our ETF structure potentially reduces this to an exposure of zero. One of the key things, however, about swap-based ETFs, it gives you access to a wider variety of asset classes, of sectors, of themes. And if you look at the toolbox, if you like, of available options to you in terms of the types of asset classes you can access, you can see that the indirect or swap-based approach goes far beyond the limitations of a direct or physical ETF structure. So we can provide access through a swap-based ETF to currency strategies, hedge fund index ETFs, certain commodity products, cash products, for example. Short and leverage products, we have at Deutsche Bank one of the largest ranges of short and leverage products in the European ETF space. Probably worth noting that these particular products are more suited to the financially sophisticated investor, and as such, you will not find them on our retail website. If you think about where ETFs have come from In terms of the European market, ETFs really only have just over a 10-year history. In terms of swap-based ETFs, they had a degree of catching up to do, but swap-based ETFs are very much here to stay. And in terms of total assets under management, the split is now roughly 50-50 between both the physical and the indirect or swap-based approach. Indeed, most new fund launches that we've seen in the last 3 years, well over 3/4 have been in the swap-based ETF structure. To summarize then, the key features of swap-based ETFs that I hope you've been able to glean from this presentation is that swap-based ETFs deliver highly effective and highly efficient index tracking. They give you access to a wider variety of markets and asset classes than are possible under the direct replication structure. And also importantly, that swap-based ETFs have evolved beyond the UCITS guidelines to limit or significantly reduce counterparty exposure. And the efforts that we've made at Deutsche Bank to go even further beyond that are there really to give you comfort in the recommendation to your clients. However, regardless of the structure that you use when using ETFs, or in fact using products such as the 7IM product range, most important of all is to know and understand the index that you're actually tracking. There are a wide variety of different indices that you can track, and there are a wide variety and different options in terms of the actual currencies in which you can track these particular indices. So take the time to know and understand the index you're tracking. Have a very close look at the tracking performance of the ETF versus the index, because at the end of the day, after all the basis points are counted up and all the various total costs of ownership are accounted for, it's the actual tracking performance versus the index, the efficiency of that index ETF, that it will effectively dictate the overall return. So check the costs of buying and selling. Check also the website information that is available on most ETF providers' websites. We have a number of research tools, research sources that you can access, and a number of guides. In particular, this new guide on precision market tracking. This is a very good guide available on our website, which takes you through the mechanics of both types of approaches and also explains in greater detail the types of agreements and the structure behind the swap-based approach. Feel free to get in touch with us either through the hotline or to contact me direct. I'll be more than happy to be of assistance. Thank you very much for taking the time to look at this presentation on swap-based ETFs. I hope you found the presentation useful and informative, and now understand that swap-based ETFs can offer a genuine and real alternative to the physical or direct replication structure. Once again, the key points to remember about swap-based ETFs: they offer perfect index tracking, a wider range of asset classes to access, and also that they have put in place measures to limit or in fact reduce entirely the level of counterparty exposure. Thank you very much.